Hello friends, welcome back to the Chickadee Knitting Club. My name is Caitlin, and I'm excited to teach you the last stitch that we'll be learning this season, the seed stitch. If you've mastered the rib stitch, then the seed stitch will be a breeze. It's the exact same as the rib stitch, but with some smaller differences that make a big impact and make the stitch look so cool. And with that in mind, let's jump right into our final tutorial of the season with the seed stitch. Alright, let's learn the seed stitch. Do you remember how the purl stitch was basically the opposite of the knit stitch? In that kind of way, the seed stitch is the opposite of the rib stitch. If you haven't seen the rib stitch tutorial, I highly recommend watching it before trying to tackle the seed stitch. And if you have seen the rib stitch tutorial, you may remember that the point of the rib stitch is that all the bumps of the stitches land in the same spot every single row. In the seed stitch, it's exactly the opposite. You want to scatter the bumps, kind of like you're scattering seeds. I'll show you what that means. You have your needles and the stitches that you've cast on. I personally like casting on an odd number of stitches for the seed stitch, but really, you can cast on as many as you'd like. Just like with the rib stitch, what you're going to do is knit a stitch, purl a stitch, knit a stitch, purl a stitch, all the way down the row. Let's try it out. Starting with the long tail, not the short tail, but the long tail behind the needle, you're going to knit your first stitch. Then you're going to take that tail, move it to the front of the needles, and purl the next stitch. Move the yarn over and knit a stitch. Move the yarn over again and purl a stitch. If you cast it on an odd number of stitches, your last two stitches are going to be a purl stitch and then a knit stitch. Time to turn the needle over, swap hands, and get started on the next row. This is what it looks like when you've worked the seed stitch for a few rows. And you can kind of see why it got its name. There's all these little bumpy little seeds on there. In Spanish, the seed stitch is known as the arroz stitch. Arroz meaning rice. And it does feel bumpy, sort of like you're holding a little handful of rice. If you look closely, you can see that the rows alternate between a V, a bump, a V, a bump, a V, a bump, because when you're knitting, you always knit so that the bump of the stitch falls in the opposite place of the stitch before it. Let's try that out. For the first stitch, can you tell where the bump is landing? In the front, that's right. So we want the bump of the stitch to fall in the back. Do you remember what stitch does that? The knit stitch, you're right. So we're going to have the yarn at the back of the needles and knit our first stitch. Let's look at the next stitch. Can you tell where the bump lands? There it is, at the back of the needles. So that means we want the next bump to land in the front of the needles. You're right, that means that we should purl the next stitch. Smooth the yarn over and purl. The next stitch has a bump in the front, which means we want the bump in the back. We knit this stitch. Do you sense a pattern here? Just like with the rib stitch, in the seed stitch, you alternate knit stitches, and purl stitches. And to keep track of when you're supposed to do each one, you can just read the fabric and tell what you're supposed to do based on the stitch that came before it. Let's try reading the fabric one more time. Now trust me, it is much easier to tell in real life when you can see it for yourself and feel it for yourself. It's a little tricky to see, but can you tell where the bump is landing on this next stitch? In the front, that's correct. So with the seed stitch, we want to knit the next stitch so that the bump lands in the back. That's right, we want to knit this next stitch. So we move our yarn over and do a knit stitch. Now if we've just done a knit stitch, we're probably going to be purling the next stitch, but let's just read the fabric and double check. Again, let's look. There's the bump behind the needle, which means that this next stitch we want to knit so the bump lands in the front. You're right, we're going to move the yarn over and purl. One last time, we're going to do a knit stitch. And there is your row of seed stitches. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful to teach you how to knit the seed stitch. If you have any questions or need any help or advice, feel free to comment under this video's post on the Chickadee Knitting Club Instagram page. This has been such a fun journey with you this season, and I wish you luck in all your knitting endeavors. See you later.